Well, good morning. It's good to be with you guys. My name is David Black. I'm the campus pastor here. And if we've never met, if it's your first time here, I just want to say welcome to you to the 11 o'clock gathering. We actually have an earlier gathering, but I'm glad to be here with you at the 11. Something we say often here at Grace is that we would rather pursue God together than to pretend to have it all together. And so that means if you're a follower of Jesus, we're glad that you're here. It also means that if you're just exploring Jesus or checking him out, it's an honor to kind of be part of that conversation with you. And our hope would be that maybe you find a community of people in which to ask some hard questions and maybe travel with as you do that. And so we are 1 week into just a 4-week series that we're talking through entitled It Hurts. Now, before we get there, I have to kind of stop for a second and just kind of tell you something about summer and just kind of how I relate to summer as a pastor. It's kind of a love-hate relationship, but here's just something I love about summer. It's this, that in summer, things change, like our schedules change, stuff changes up, which here's what this means practically for kind of our church during the summer. It means that at times, like I'll see you a little bit and then I won't see you a little bit, and that's totally fine. But what I love about summer is that people have an opportunity to kind of get in, maybe be less hurried, maybe make a connection that they haven't made before, and find that community in the midst of where they're at. And here's a quick commercial for you. If you're going, how can I stay connected in the summer? You're on vacation, you're out, all that stuff, just know what's going on. This is do with it what you want. You can go to our homepage, scroll down halfway through the middle of the page on your phone. Less than that if you're on your computer. Just sign up for something that's called the midweek. It literally is a midweek email. And I know that might be old-fashioned for you, or maybe it's too new for you still if you're in a different category, right? But that's just how we communicate what's happening as a church throughout the summer. So you can go on vacation, you can have a good time, and you can stay connected. As I said, thank you for that just for a minute. Just so there you go. That's how we do it. I just want you to stay connected and know what's going on. We're in the middle of a series entitled It Hurts. And kind of the big idea behind it is this statement that we're traveling through. And it's this, that hurt gets heavier the longer you hold it. That hurt, as a fact, this isn't a Christian thing. This isn't like a follower of Jesus thing. This is an everybody thing, right? This isn't just a Bible thing. This is the just what it means to be human. That as human beings, hurt gets heavier the longer we hold it. In fact, this metal band called Memphis May Fire says this, heavy is the weight that I hold, the weight that I hold. I carry it because it's all that I know. This is all that I know. Pressure on me, pressure to be true to who I am. Heavy is the weight that I hold. And they would know that because they're a heavy metal band. That's how they figured that out, right? And what they're saying there is kind of this universal fact that hurt seems all right maybe when we're a kid. It stinks when we're going through it, and we think maybe I'll outgrow it, or maybe I'll outrun it, and maybe you get in your 20s and you do all this stuff, but then when you get to your 30s, you start having kids, and you're like, oh my goodness, how do I keep this from them? And you don't know how, and it follows you and gets heavier and heavier and heavier and heavier. Here's 100% the confession as followers of Jesus, if you're a follower of Jesus. And I know we're not all a follower of Jesus who comes here, it's fine. Some of you are just checking it out. But as a follower of Jesus, you do not get a pass on pain. We don't get a pass on pain. We might believe what Jesus did in our past to take care of our past and our sin, and we might be looking forward to the promise of life with him one day forever when he makes the world right and takes care of injustice and turns everything the way it ought to be. And yet we live not as perfect people in a not perfect world. And so here's the temptation for followers of Jesus. That we would do just what everyone else does, that we would deny it, our hurt, or that we might be defined by our hurt, but that we would never deal with our hurt. And so, again, if you're a follower of Jesus, there is an advantage to that, and that's simply this. What would it look like, and this is the series, what would it look like if we brought our hurt to him? You're like, what would that look like? I don't even know how to do that. Like, what would that be like to bring our hurt to God? Not to go ahead and gut it out and say, I'm just going to bear it. not to explain it away, but just to deal with it and talk to him about it. And last week, here's what we said. We said where we got to start is this. We have to start by saying it out loud to him. And last week we said God cares about us getting articulate. He's the kind of God that we can just throw our heart at and be honest with him because he actually wants to hear it. And this week we're going to continue looking further in that. And we're going to look again in a book of the Bible, which it wasn't always a book. It was a scroll called the Scroll of Psalms. And in that scroll, it was comprised of 5 books or 5 sections. If you're not familiar, Psalms would have been a book in the central place of the life of the Jewish people. In fact, the word Psalms literally means praises in Hebrew. So if you're going to learn the Hebrew language, you're like, what's the word for praises? Well, it's Psalms. And I guess you can figure, like you probably already know, you don't have to know Hebrew to know what this book then might be about. There's songs that they would sing, a lot like what we sang earlier. Some of the language in that song, Honey in the Rock, in fact, most of it comes out of the book of praises called Psalms. And what's interesting, though, is even though it's called praises, here's what I was just blown away to find out this week. 40% of the book of Psalms is about sorrow or hurt. You're like, we got to rename that book. Right? What if someone's like, hey, we're going to have a book called Praises, and yet 40% of it is full of pain? Like, well, pain doesn't make a good selling name for a book, right? Who reads that book? Right? But what I thought was interesting is this. I was reading a guy talk about this, and he said, we often think that the name of the book needs to change. And he's like, but here's what I've found often. He says this. He's like, I've found that what really needs to change is our definition of what it means to praise. And for some reason, when you look at the Bible and when you look at the Hebrew scripture, here's what they're trying to convey. That praise and pain aren't mutually exclusive. That they're actually a lot closer related than we would like to admit. And so today we're going to take a look at a psalm. It's actually Psalm 40, in which the author of this psalm, a guy named David, famous king, David and Goliath, that David, David and Bathsheba, also that David, talks about pain, but he also talks about praise. So I'm going to read 17 verses for you. We're not going to go verse by verse through every verse. That's 17 today together. So when I read this, don't go, oh, when are we getting out of here? Okay? But it's important for us to read this whole thing as a song together. In fact, some of you don't need what I'm about to say after this. Some of you need this the most right here. Here's what David says in Psalm 40. He says, I waited patiently for the Lord. He inclined to me and heard my cry. He drew me up from the pit of destruction, out of the miry bog. He set my feet upon a rock, making my steps secure. He put a new song in my mouth, a song of praise to our God. Many will see and fear and put their trust in the Lord. Blessed is the man or woman who makes the Lord his trust, who does not turn to the proud, to those who go astray after a lie. You have multiplied, O Lord, my God, your wondrous deeds and your thoughts towards us. No one can compare with you. I will proclaim and tell of them, yet they are more than can be told. In sacrifices and offerings you have not delighted, but you've given me an open ear. Burnt offerings and sin offerings you have not required. Then I said, behold, I've come. In the scroll of the book, it is written of me, I delight to do your will, O my God. Your law is within my heart. I have told the glad news of deliverance in the great congregation. Behold, I have not restrained my lips. As you know, O Lord, I have not hidden your deliverance within my heart. I have spoken of your faithfulness and your salvation. I have not concealed your steadfast love and your faithfulness from the great congregation. As for you, O Lord, you will not restrain your mercy from me. Your steadfast love and your faithfulness will ever preserve me. For evils have encompassed me beyond number. My iniquities, that's an old word for my sin or my failure, have overtaken me, and I cannot see. They are more than the hairs of my head, and my heart fails me. Be pleased, O Lord, to deliver me. O Lord, make haste to help me. Let those be put to shame and disappointed altogether who seek to snatch away my life. Let those be turned back and brought to dishonor who delight in my heart. Let those be appalled because their shame who say to me, aha, aha. But may all who seek you rejoice and be glad in you. May those who love your salvation say continually, great is the Lord. As for me, I am poor and needy, but the Lord takes thought for me. You are my help and my deliverer. Do not delay, oh my God. Last week, we said, hey, we got to start when it comes to what hurts by saying it out loud to him. This week, here's what comes loud and clear through the psalm. You may not understand everything that David's talking about, but one thing, the main thing that he keeps coming back to over and over and over again, and kind of the next thing for us after we say it out loud to the Lord is this. Hey, how about we ask him for help? Yeah, ask him for help. And here's why this is so important. You know, whether you're a follower of Jesus or you're just checking out Jesus, here's what we tend to think, at least in the United States, that help is nice but not necessary. And yet for David, it seems pretty necessary. We should ask for help. Well, why would we do that? Well, I think he makes a couple of things pretty clear. The first thing is this, that we should ask because healing rarely happens without it. Healing rarely happens without help, either from someone else or from God. In fact, he starts off not by talking about the pain that he's currently experiencing. He starts off by talking about past pain that God helped him out of. In fact, he's telling this story in verses 1 through 3, and this is what we see there. He says, I waited patiently for the Lord, and he inclined to me. Now, before you go ahead and just say, oh, that's a fancy way of saying something, what he means is that there's a God who leans in when we start talking. That's pretty important. Because we maybe grew up in a family where we start talking and people take a step back. Or maybe we have friends who, when we start talking about our life, they start looking down at their phone. Or maybe we have others who, when we start talking, they're like, man, you're always talking about that. And they start giving us solutions and answers that we don't want to hear at that moment. All we want to do is make a connection with somebody. And when we start talking to God, David's like, there's a God. And do you know what he does when we start talking? He leans in. That's fantastic. And he heard. And not only that, he drew me out of this pit. I was like in this miry, slimy, stuck bog, and he pulled me out of that. And where I am now, it's not slimy and squishy and stuck. It's actually pretty solid and firm. It's like a rock. He put me there. And I was just in that bog, and nothing I could see or say was new. It was the same old, the same old problem. It was the only thing that I could see and talk about. And now, because he's put me somewhere else and brought about some healing in my life, you know what else he's given me? Something new to say. And that's my life now. Man, that's a fantastic story. You're like, man, I wish that could be my story. In fact, maybe if you grew up in church, you recognize this story. It's an old church word called a testimony, right? When someone's like, hey, let me tell you what God's done for me. Let me tell you about my life, and let me tell you about where I was, and let me tell you what God has done for me. And they start talking about their hurt, but then they also start talking about this healing that God brought about emotionally, physically, mentally, relationally. And you're like, wow. And yet, here's what I found to be true as a pastor. Every one of those stories, as much as the hurt and the healing are there, there's also something else that's in common, and it's right here in this passage. And you know what that is? It's a cry for help. Between David's hurt and some healing, he actually at some point goes, I cried for help and God heard me. You know, that's the story of the entire Bible. That's the story of the entire God of the universe. That whenever humans cry for help, he hears, he leans in, and he acts. In fact, 66 times in this Old Testament alone, 66 times the Bible tells us that people cried for help. God heard them. In fact, one of the most famous ones is found in Exodus chapter 2. Remember Moses and Pharaoh? Maybe you heard that story. Maybe you saw some of the movies or the dramatizations, right? Children of Israel were slaves, and Exodus says this, the people of Israel groaned because of the slavery and cried out for help, and God heard their groaning, and he actually intervened. Second Chronicles talks about a big battle that the guy who was the king at the time, his name was Jehoshaphat, right? And you're like, sorry for that name, but that was his name. right? And they found where the king was, and they were attacking him. And he individually was not a great man. He wasn't like some godly guy. He was just the king. And here's what we find. They turned to fight against him, and Jehoshaphat cried out, and the Lord helped him specifically. God helped him and drew them away from him. That's crazy. Nehemiah, a guy who built a wall, he kind of brought back the people of Israel into their homeland after they'd been kicked out and their land was destroyed. They started rebuilding this rubble, and he starts talking to them about their past and their history. Here's what he says to them. He says, let me talk to you about your past. He says, and in the time of their suffering, they cried out to you, talking about God, and you heard them from heaven, and according to your great mercies, you gave them saviors who saved them from the hand of their enemies. The history of God and his people is they cry and he comes running. That's the type of God that he is. You cry, say help, and he's not like, again? He comes running. Now, what's interesting to me is that the way that David talks about help in this story is not the way that we talk about help as Americans or as Westerners, right? He talks about help like it's an easy thing. He's like, I love to cry for help. I just yell help and God comes running. We don't have that relationship when it comes to help, right? In fact, they did this study. They took a bunch of people of all different walks of life, older and younger, and they said, we're going to take you to Times Square in New York City. Now, if you've ever been to Times Square in New York City, it is sensory overload, right? Signs, people. If you've ever been in New York and talked to New Yorkers, you know that there's not a lot of time given to you, right? Because everyone's got somewhere to be. In fact, they're walking, and if they're not on their phone, they're walking really quickly. And if you try to hand someone a flyer, they're just going to walk right by. If you try to say hello, they're like, and it's just the fast pace of life at which they move. And so they took this group of people, and they said, okay, we're going to send you out into Times Square. And here's what we want you to do. We want you to say to a bunch of New Yorkers who are running around, hey, we don't have our phone. Can we use yours? Okay, so you're going to interrupt some New Yorkers on their way to work, and you're going to go, hey, I don't have anything to communicate with someone. Can I see the most valuable thing maybe that you own right now? Can I use that? Can you take time out of your schedule to do that? And here's what they said. We want you to write down how many times you got to ask before someone will give you their phone. Okay? How many times? And so they had everyone write down the average. Anybody want to guess what the average time that everyone thought it would take? You can say it out loud. It's all right. What do you got? I heard 50? Yeah, maybe because we're Southerners and we're like the North, I don't know, right? 50? Not quite 50. It was 6, okay? They had a little bit more hope in humanity than us. 6 times. They had to write, that was kind of the average. Maybe someone wrote 50, but maybe somebody wrote 1, and that kind of worked out. Do you know what the average actually was? 2. They'd ask 2 people. 2 times. That's the way it worked. Which they said, hey, scientifically proves that we as people underestimate other people's willingness to help us. You know what I found out to be true as a pastor? We do the same thing with God. We underestimate his willingness to help us. Here's what we think. I think I grew up in church. I know the facts. I sung the songs. I know he's mighty. I know he's strong. I know he loves me. Jesus loves me. This I know. And yet, just because I know all that stuff doesn't mean that I ask him for help. You could sit in church week after week and never actually ask him to help. Like, it's not osmosis. Like, you don't just sit down and it's like magic stuff comes from the ceiling. That's not how this works, right? It's a relationship. Here's what I know is true about me, and maybe this is true about you. I hear about the cool stuff that God does in rescuing other people, and yet I still think that he gets tired of hearing from me. We go, man, God, I don't know if you want to hear this. I don't know if you want me to come to you again and ask. I'm sorry, it's the same thing again. There's a guy named Peter. He actually denied Jesus. Jesus went back and got him, and then he was really influential in the early church. And here's what he says to a church not much bigger than this one. He says, listen, he says, casting all your anxieties, some versions say cares, on God. Why? Because he cares for you. He wants to hear your help. He wants to hear what hurts. He wants you to ask him that. Abraham Lincoln put it this way when it comes to us as people. He says, it is the duty of the nations as well as of men to own, and that should say to owe their dependence upon the overruling power of God. What's he saying? He's saying this, that when it comes to countries and to people, the real relationship, the right relationship, the actual relationship is that we need his help. That's how it works. It's what it's made to be. That God actually wants to have that type of relationship. That's what got us in trouble in the first place. Think about this. If you're like, man, I don't know if I want to ask for help, how else is healing going to happen? Like, what story or testimony was like, this was really painful, I just stuffed it down and never thought about it, and the next thing I know, it was all better? Whose story is that? Like, it's great. How was your week? Oh, it's great. I've got stuff from the past I've never dealt with, but it's all gone. I just woke up this morning, it's just all gone. Right? Who's like, I had 5 children and all the things that hurt me. No problem now. Right? No, it magnifies it, man. You're like, oh, man, I was dealing with some stuff. Anger and rage and shame and grief. And I got married, and this woman just fixed everything, right? This man just told me what I needed to do, and now everything's fine, right? You're like, no, that's not it at all. How else, if you don't go help, is there going to be some healing to your hurt? Here's why I think this is important, because God knows us. David knows us. We have to ask because I'm often tempted or convinced that I can handle it. Like, I got it. It's not that big. I can deal with it. I got that hurt. In fact, here's what we see. Psalm 40, he continues in verse 4. Right after he gets done talking about what God did for him, he's like, hey, blessed is the man or woman who makes the Lord their trust. And they said, who does not what? Turn to the proud. Or like, when I say turn to the proud, you got somebody in mind probably in your head, right? Yep, so did they, actually. This is an idiom. An idiom is a linguistic tool that uses words to mean something different. So for example, if I said, hey, it's raining cats and dogs. If you did not know English and you were trying to understand by what I said, it is raining cats and dogs, you're like, what country is this? Like, what is, or you're going, you're insane. Why? Because the phrase cats and dogs means it's raining a lot, right? Well, why didn't you just say that? I don't know. That's how it works. This phrase, turn to the proud, is an idiom, and it means literally this. In original Hebrew, it says this, act like Egypt. Say, what? Act like Egypt? Yeah, do you remember Egypt in the, like, let my people go deal? How did Pharaoh do with, like, going, okay? He didn't. He was pretty stubborn. In fact, he said no, and every time that Moses went back and said, God says this, God wants this, God needs this, Pharaoh's like, no, 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 and his heart got harder and harder and harder and harder and harder, right? Listen, your pain plus your pride is a bad recipe. Bad recipe. It will lead you to a hard and angry heart. Job 36:13 says this, says, those whose hearts are ungodly are always angry. Even when God puts them in chains, they don't cry out for help. You're like, wait, God does what? Right? What's he saying? He's saying, look, even if God allowed them to be bound up in chains, going, hey, I'm here to help you, they wouldn't do it. Like, no, I got this on my own. I was walking through my neighborhood when I first moved in. I was walking my dog, and I heard an ungodly noise. And it was the mixture of some humans screaming and some animals screaming. And that animal actually was a cat. And it was not this person's cat, but she was feeding it. So in my book, that's your cat, but we could debate about that all day, right? So this cat was on a fence exactly like the fence that's here. And the cat decided to jump off the fence, but when the cat jumped off the fence, its back leg got caught between the pickets. And it was hanging by that back leg for quite some time. In fact, I don't want to get too detailed here, but you could tell because of the markings on the fence that had been there for a while. So I ran quickly, took my dog, put the dog home, and I came back to the lady. And for about 10 minutes, myself, a lady, and another neighbor who had come over tried to get close enough to free this cat. But we couldn't. And it wasn't because it was difficult to reach the fence or difficult to reach the cat. Do you know what the number one problem in freeing that cat was? The cat. Yeah, you guys know cats, right? Yeah. Yeah, why? Because it thinks it's dying and it doesn't want us near it. It's biting and it's clawing and it's actively working against us in the midst of it. I had to go home. We had to get 5 towels and just like almost suffocate this thing to get it off the fence, right? It's the same thing for people and their pride and their pain. That's why we say hurt people hurt people. That's why when you go to help a friend and you're like, hey man, I want to help you, and they come at you with their claws and their fangs. And you're like, whoa, I'm just trying to free your leg. Whoa, I'm just trying to help you out. And they're like, no. Why? Because there's pride. If we're to be honest, that's why we do it ourselves. And the difficulty here is that we don't like to be weak. We don't like when our hurt actually exposes our true condition. Ray Ortlund puts it this way in his book, The Gospel. He says this: here then are the choices we all face moment by moment. Will we aim to be impressive? Will we expect to be in complete control? Or will we be happy for the power of Christ to rest upon us in our endless weakness? No man can give at once the impression that he himself is clever and that Jesus is mighty to save at the same time. There's no scenario where you're like, God, help me. I got it all together. Those two things are mutually exclusive. You cannot look like you spiritually got it all intact. You cannot have a religious relationship in which you are perfect and yet at the same time go, Jesus, I need you, because you don't. Because in your pride, you're going, I got it. It's only when we're like, hey, I'm weak, that God goes, that's right, and I'm strong, and I'm here. Listen, here's what happens. Hurt will lie to you about what the solution is to your problem. In fact, David says this in this next verse. He says, look, to those who go astray after a lie. What's he saying? He's saying that when pain and pride get together, they start to lie to you, and you start pursuing things that are not helpful. In fact, your pain will push you to pursue things that will ultimately lead to more hurt in your life if you're not careful. That's why we know, and sometimes maybe even we ourselves, we struggle with addiction. Because there's unresolved, undealt with hurt that we don't want to ask for help with. And so we start thinking, oh, maybe food will help, or maybe alcohol will help, or maybe a drug will help, or maybe when I view things that make me feel great, that will help, or maybe working will help. And we begin to pursue good things that God gave us, yet in ways that are harmful to us because they're not God and they're not able to save and they're not able to deliver us, but we go, maybe they will, and they don't. They hurt us. Maybe for us, it's not addiction. You know what it is? If I just be fair, probably in this room, I'm not saying that we don't struggle with addiction in this place, but I'm saying that for the general population, for us, it's distraction. You're like, hey man, I'm not addicted, but I like to be distracted. And so maybe I'm not addicted to food yet, but I'm distracted by it. And maybe for me, I'm not addicted to technology, but my phone, it's a great distraction. And so when I'm hurt and when I don't want to deal with it, and when it gets a little too close, there's a foxhole in my phone, and I go there to be alone. That's what I do. We try to get away from it, and here's what happens. The things that we think will provide our salvation prove to be our prisons, because we don't want to ask for help. And we got hurt that we're carrying around. See, this is why even if you're not a follower of Jesus and you go to some 10-step, 7, 8-step, whatever step program, here's what they'll tell you, and they're right. That asking for help is the first sign of health. Because help, think about it, help is tied to humility. You got to go, I'm not it. And maybe you're going, I'm not it, but I don't know what's it, but I know that I'm not it. Well, that's a great place to start. Because here's why. We've got to ask him for help. Healing doesn't really happen without it. Oftentimes I try to take care of it and do it myself. But here's what I need to understand, what David's trying to get us to understand, that he wants my heart, not just my hurt. You see, what he's dealing with is not some sort of relationship where I go and do the religious thing, he waves his magic wand and he moves on. In fact, we see that in this next long section here. David moves from talking about this past thing that God did with deliverance and starts talking about what it looks like to be someone who trusts God. And he's like, hey, sacrifices, burnt offerings, all that stuff, that's not what you want. In other words, he's calling out loud and recognizing, God, you don't want a relationship where I bring you my hurt like a vending machine. I put a few dollars in the plate or online or whatever. I sing a couple songs. I pull the lever. My hurt's gone. We're good. And I leave out and go to the rest of the world. That's not how that works. Now, you would be surprised in the South because that seems to be how we think it works. But God's not going, hey, come to me for your hurt. I'm a hurt machine. You put the coin in and it's gone. He's going, I actually want a relationship with your heart. And so, yes, I want your hurt. But man, I want your heart as well. That's what he talks about in this next section. That's why he says, hey, then I said, I've come. I want to be like the person you've written about in this book. I'm going to obey your will. I'm talking about your goodness and your gospel in the congregation, and that would have been the people of Israel. Like, what does all that mean? We'll get there in a second, but don't miss the fact that he is actually participating in what God is doing. This requires submission. He's saying, I am going to submit, God. I'm going to be the type of person who submits my heart and my hurt to your care and your counsel. Tell me, what do I got to do? I don't know if you've ever been in physical therapy, but you want to talk about hurt? They will hurt you in physical therapy. And they'll tell you it's good. But you're like, I don't know if this is good or not. Because it's hard to see that. In fact, physical therapy is different from surgery. Surgery, they give you anesthesia, you're out, right? You find a good doctor and you're like, yep, give it to me, give me the good stuff, I'm out. And you hope that when you wake up, they go, hey, everything went fine. Just a few more, they take these and we'll see you later. We'll follow up with you. But physical therapy is not like that, although you wish it was, right? Physical therapy is, they're not going to give you something to knock you out. Physical therapy actually requires you to listen and partner with the person who is working to create a plan to bring about your healing. Physical therapy is like, hey, this is going to hurt, but I need you to trust me that I know that there's a greater range of motion and a greater range of use for this part of your life, your arm, your elbow, your knee, your leg. And if you will trust me, and if you'll work with me, if you will submit to my care and the words coming out of my mouth and the program that I've laid out before you, you will have better range of motion than you ever thought you could, and you will bring about some healing in your life. That's the way it works with God. That we have to be humble enough to come to him and go, God, here's my life. What's the plan? Give me your counsel and give me your care. And even though it hurts, I'll follow it and I'll work it and I'll be with you in that. Notice there's two things that David points out in this verse. One, obedience. I delight to do your will, oh my God. Your law is within my heart. I'll obey you. And then he starts talking crazy about the fact that he brought up something when he was at church. Like, what do you mean? He's like saying, I spoke of it in the congregation. He says, I've spoken of your faithfulness and your salvation. I have not concealed your steadfast love and your faithfulness from the great congregation. What does that mean? Well, he's talking about others. He's saying, when I showed up around other people, I actually was talking about how good you are and your gospel and being reminded of that over and over and over again. In other words, I'm going to obey you, God, and I'm going to actually show up around other people and participate in who you are and the life of the community in which you've placed me, which here's maybe what you're already doing the math on. Do you know what the hardest two things to do when you're hurt are? Do you know where the hardest parts of your life to submit to God's care and his counsel are? One is obedience. Hey, I want you to follow me even though you think that I might have hurt you. Hey, I want you to follow me even though you might not be 100%. Hey, I want you to do that difficult thing even though you're not feeling it. And others. Hey, I want you to show up around the body of Christ and let people love you. Hey, I want you to consider what the gospel might mean for you, the good news of Jesus might mean for you in the midst of your pain. Because we're like, God, take away the pain, then I'll obey. God, take away the pain, and then I'll be with people. But I don't know if I can do both those things because that's a lot. And God's like, if you will submit to the things that I've given you and work the plan through the pain, it actually will be for your healing and your good. Because I don't know about you, but here's what I do. I don't participate with God. I isolate myself. I'm going to isolate myself from others. I'm going to isolate myself from this word. I'm going to stop talking to him. I'm going to shut down because it's hard and it hurts. But God's like, no, 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 no. I want you to come to me. That's the relationship I want with you. I want you to trust me. I want to hear from you. I want to help you. A lady named Aubrey Hopner, she's an author, she says this: sometimes gently, sometimes forcefully, he reveals to us that we are not able to meet our own needs, but that he desires to fill us with his own provision and grace where we are weak. What if God did not want you to be self-sufficient? Because what if that was a lie? What if the greatest idol that we have as people in the West is our independence? And what if, in the midst of the hurt, what he desires most of all is to be your help? Say, really? Yeah. Why? Because listen, as people, you know what we do? At least I do this. I'm like, how, God? How are you going to solve this? How are you going to take this away? How are you going to fix this? How are you going to, just how? It's so large and it's so big. But what's interesting to me is David doesn't really talk about how as much. Do you know what David is consumed with through this entire section? It's who. In fact, for David, when it comes to hurt, who is bigger than how? Because for him, here's what he says: help is who God is. And all I know is if I got him, that's the good news. That he is the one who's helping me. He jumps back into his present pain. And he talks about three things. Three things as he wraps up. He's like, hey, God, right now my sin, my iniquity, he's like, evils, they're around me. They've overtaken me. He says, verse 14, my enemies, they're not much better. He says, let those who've be turned back and brought to dishonor who delight in my hurt. There's people that love the fact that I'm hurting. He talks about his sin, and he talks about his enemies, but then he goes, I want to talk about my help. And who my help is, that's you. He goes, you know what's awesome? He goes, you thought of me. That's amazing. That the God of the universe, in the midst of our hurt, thought of us. There's 100 things that he's holding together, 100 of things that he's got going on. He's actually literally causing gravity to still happen and things in this world to continue to function. Your heart is still beating. Molecules and things inside your cells are still working. Stars are exploding and becoming new stars. And the God of the universe also thought of you in your hurt. And here's what he says: you are my help and my deliverer. That's who you are. You are my help. That's the relationship we have together with you. You, my help. You're my help. It says, don't delay. And listen, that's the same thing that God longs to hear from us. He longs for us to be humble enough to go, hey, you're my help. I got my sin, and I got my enemies, and I got my problems, but don't delay, because this is the relationship. I'm not God, you are. You say, how can you be so sure? Well, here's why. Because God literally became help for us. He literally became it. He humbled himself to the point of becoming like a human who experiences pain. He humbled himself to go to the cross for our sin, which was our first problem. Not just living in a broken world as imperfect people, we ourselves were part of the problem. And God goes, I'm going to do something about that. In fact, there's a verse in Hebrews that talks about Jesus. Notice what it says. Just check this out. Hebrews chapter 5, verse 10, verse 4 through 7. Here's what it says. It's impossible for the blood of bulls and goats to take away our sins. That's the problem we had. We couldn't help it. We couldn't do anything about it. On our own, we're lost. Consequently, when Jesus came into the world, here's what Jesus said. He puts these words, see if you recognize them. Sacrifices and offerings you've not desired, but a body you have prepared for me. In burnt offerings and sin offerings you have taken no pleasure. Then I said, who's saying this? Jesus. Behold, I've come to do your will, O God, as it is written of me in the scroll of the book. What's he saying? Hey, that Jesus, you want to see what it looks like to trust God? You want to see what it looks like to give your heart to him fully? There is one who humbled himself, gave his heart to God in the midst of hurt, and God took it and crushed him under the weight of our sin so that we might have a direct connection to that God. So that God might not be our enemy, but that he might be our help from that point on forever. A sophomore year, I stayed in a dorm that was more than one story, and when you do that in colleges, because of liability reasons and health, I guess, I don't know, they go ahead and they put an elevator there. And so they gave a bunch, I don't know, maybe close to 1,000 18 to 20-year-old guys an elevator to play with for a year. And we did. It was great. Man, we used to just put random crap on the elevator and send it down and just have it open up on the next floor, right? I'll let you figure out all that stuff, right? We would get guys from the hall and we'd be like, how many of us can we fit in that elevator? And it became a record that we had to break. Hey, like, it was actually a spot written in the dorm, like on the wall of the year and the class and the names and how many were in the elevator. Beat that, right? That's what we did, right? And so we tried to beat it. And we were it was cornfields. There was not a lot going on, right? So we would shove ourselves in this elevator, and undoubtedly at some point during the season, we shoved ourselves in the elevator, and we're all in there, and it goes, it stops. And we're not on the first floor, and we're not on the second floor. We're in between it. And there's a lot of us in here. We did not intend to be in here very long. And just, it just started smelling not great, and it wasn't good. It was uncomfortable. So some guys literally start joking around, right? Hey, oh, this is funny. And then, right, the door won't open. So there's guys on the basketball team, football team, they're trying to open up the door. They can't get it, right? And then people go from being ha-ha to hello, hey, anybody? This is before cell phones, okay? Right? There's bang, they start banging on the door. Boom, 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 boom. Hey, we can't, hello, boom, boom, boom. And then everyone else thinks it's funny because they're not helping us. So we're else boom, boom, boom. And then it starts getting even more real. And then you got 18 to 20-year-olds who are kind of halfway freaking out. And no one really wants to be the guy who's crying for their mom, but we all kind of feel like that in that moment, right? And so it becomes like a real emergency. And I don't know, when you're kind of an adult, but not yet, I don't know how that works, right? You got to have that I don't know, I think we need an adult, but I think I'm supposed to be one right now. It's just a mess. And we're all freaking out. And then, literally, one guy manages to get this red phone off the hook. And he's like, hello? And everyone stops talking and banging. And he's like, yeah, we're stuck in elevator. And he names the name of the thing and he puts it down. And everyone's like, what's going on? He's like, they're on their way. And you're like, who? Who's on their way? And then he's like, maintenance, right? You're like, yeah, maintenance. Because that's what maintenance does. They sit by the phone and someone thought about it and they're like, if someone gets stuck in here, we should probably have somebody who answers the other end of this and then who's equipped to come and get them out. And so they just picked it up and there was a direct connection. And they did it. came, they got us out. And we said, thank you so much. And the guy's like, no problem. You know, it's like a Tuesday for him. He goes back home, right? Back to waiting for the next phone call. But listen, as silly and as crazy as that is, I just thought about, man, how often we are banging on the wall of our life. We're screaming, we're kind of joking. You're like, I don't know if I need an adult yet. I don't know, but I hurt, and where's that fallen? And yet, God has created a direct connection to him, to our help. And he's like, just ask. Just ask. I'm not saying healing comes immediately. I'm not even specifying what that's like. I'm just saying that he loves it when we ask. So this morning, I thought that's what we could do. So maybe for you, yes, last week, you're like, I said it out loud. This week, here's what I'd love for you to do. Invite him into that conversation by going, can you help me with this hurt? Would you help me with this hurt? In other words, I need it because I'm not solving it. Let's do that together, yeah? God, we just ask that you would help us again. Thank you that you never get tired of us asking, that you never go, you're back again, but that you actually long to be our help, that you made us as humans who need it. God, may we never get so proud that we stop asking for it. So Lord, I pray for the specific hurt that we carry, whether that be from childhood or life or wounds of other people or our own sin or somebody else's sin. We go on and on and on and on. But God, the one common thing we want to have as a church is that you be our help. We don't want to be perfect people. We don't want to be people without pain. We want to be people who have the same help in a God who died for us. God, would you take away our pride? Would you turn us into people who actually point others to you in that help? Thank you for Jesus. It's in his name we pray. Amen.